Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Marlene Tadros, and I will be the moderator today of this panel. The panel is a side event of the UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. It is entitled Egypt's Vulnerability to Water Stress and Climate Change, Scientific and Political Perspectives. We will discuss the alarming forecasts of water scarcity in populous Egypt and the regional and global implications of Egypt's water and climatic vulnerabilities. Just some logistics before we begin. We will have 20 minutes for each panelist, after which the audience may pose questions in the chat, time permitting. And I will read as many of your questions as we can after the end of both presentations. I would like to add that today's session is in English. We will be having another one in hopefully a couple of weeks in Arabic to discuss the same issue. My esteemed guests today are Dr. Assam Heggi, NASA water scientist working on several research projects on the impacts of climate change and desertification over arid areas, and Dr. Amr Hamzawi, director of the Middle East program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome to both of you. It's a pleasure to have you. So without further ado, Dr. Assam, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Many thanks, Marlene. Many thanks, Amr, for having me. And I think this is a very important time to talk about the water budget deficit in Egypt. So first, not because we are just Egyptian or from Egyptian background, but any person working in water, in the field of water domain, water research, they care about the strongest phenomena, the most unknown and most unstudied research area. And in the case for Egypt, we have the largest water deficit in any nation in Africa and potentially one of the highest on the planet. So it's a magnet for many researchers who work in water field. This is why Egyptian scientists or non-Egyptians are working on that. So this is everything we're going to be saying here. It's not a political statement or an official statement. It's a scientific statement of how water research, when left behind, we have reached such situation with an alarming deficit for Egypt. So I will share my slides. And okay, so our topic is very, this presentation is going to be very simplistic. It's not made for the science community. It's made for very normal people, the public who is interested in just understanding water scarcity. So in which we're going to be talking about Egypt, water and climate vulnerability from the physical perspective and how they interchange between each other. So first of all, when we talk about climate change, we tend to think of the Greenland, of Antarctica, the melting of the ice, but we don't tend to think that desert areas also undergo climate change, and that the signature of that climate change is really represented in the budget change of these nations. So most of the arid areas, which is North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula and Central Asia, the impact of climate change is mostly materialized in the change in the water cycle in general. So water stress in dry area, and this is very important. So first of all, there are few things we need to learn about water stress. The first thing is that water scarcity never happened by surprise. I mean, you never wake up in the morning and you find that you are in a water disaster. It comes from ignoring environmental, climatic, demographic, and operational constraints for decades. So it's all these people who think, oh, climate change, come on, it's not there. Environment, it's a luxury. So demographic explosion, it's okay, we can live with it. All of these have led to the crisis where we are today. There are mistakes also in water management made at every level. So from the level of water distribution companies to the top management of water resources in the authority. And the lack of comprehensive long-term vision is also one of the reasons. And these are not specific for Egypt, but they are really in every place where we see water scarcity. The lack of official water efficiency program, the whole idea that if we need to produce more water, cheaper water, and we don't address water efficiency in the way we should, so how can we use less water? And I give you here one nice example. The city of Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, it has increased its population by 3 and is still using the same water resources it's using from 1965. So you increase the population, but you increase the efficiency also of your water resource so that you don't need more water. Subsidized water is an issue. Water scientists and engineers are not valued, but they need really to be the heroes of the nation because they keep it hydrated. We have also, we need to build a cultural and societal respect for water, which we're still far away from having that in Egypt. So let's show some of how we mitigate drought and water scarcity. Usually we mitigate water scarcity by tapping to groundwater resources. And even these water resources, the groundwater resources which we tap to mitigate the shortage in Nile flow or shortage in water, they are continuously under pressure. And I will not go through the detail how we calculate the water budget model, but this is the annual water budget deficit we have in Egypt in 2016, which is this number, and this is 2050 under different climatic models, which are dry and average and wet, and under the 5 SSP model, which are the socio-economic pathway developed by the United Nations. And we see that the budget deficit in Egypt is rising up to about, on average, 32,000 billion cubic meter, and knowing that Egypt's total water budget is 80 billion cubic meters. So this is a huge component of the water budget. And if you look to Algeria doesn't have a deficit, Libya have a deficit, Tunisia does not have one, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar. So several nations in the Middle East have a deficit, but not as big as the one which is in Egypt. And when you look regionally, there are 3 nations that their water budget deficit is problematic: Yemen, Egypt, and Libya. And so this is the deficit in 2016, in blue, the deficit in 2050, and you can see that Egypt is the one that have the biggest change in the water budget deficit per capita due to the increase in population. And what that will make, it will add high vulnerability to the food security of the nation. So you should expect increase in food prices, which we are already looking at in Egypt. Combined with the low GDP of these 3 nations, this is causing these 3 nations to go to what we think would be an irreversible socio-economic instability if the water issue does not fix. So you can have the best politician on the planet, you can address the best system in governance and management, but there is a truth here that your water resources does not have to be fixed before fixing anything else. So the Nile is the major water resource for Egypt. So the Nile is the longest river on the planet, but it is one that have very low flow. So the flow of the Nile is a fraction of the Amazon, for instance. And again, I'm speaking in a very simplified way. And then the Nile Basin Initiative, it's basically was funded by the nation who are the Nile riparian in 1999 to look to joint scenarios in managing the water resources in the Nile River. But something very specific about the Nile, it's the only river on the planet that is crossing 4 climatic regions. So wet, semi-arid, the arid, hyper-arid, and then the Mediterranean climate. And this is make of the Nile very vulnerable to climatic changes. So I will not go in the numbers, but the Nile is composed of 9 sub basins. Each of these, they produce water volume that contribute to the Nile downstream in Sudan and Egypt. So the change in fluctuation, or the fluctuation precipitation, the damming in these basin will trigger change in the water budget for Egypt. So the Nile is also a very unstable, I would say in easy word, have an unrepeatable flow. So if you look to this flow of the Nile at the Aswan, so the Dongola station, and this is from 1900 to 2000, and you can see the Nile is averaged around 85 billion cubic meter per year. So it goes ups and down, up and down, up and down. And Egypt and Sudan, they share. So Egypt have 55 billion cubic meters, Sudan 18 billion cubic meter. That's the share downstream. There is no specific water share allocated for Ethiopia, and which is part of the problem in sharing the Nile water management, that there is allocation downstreams and there is no allocation upstream, which is of course problematic when managing water resources in a basin like the Nile. So Egypt has its water reserve in the Nile basin, in Lake Nasser, and in a very simple way, Lake Nasser act as the guard against changes in the Nile flow. It regulate the Nile flow, and it have an active storage of 90 billion cubic meter, which is the storage we can use to mitigate water shortages. And it have 31 billion cubic meter of a dead storage. It's a storage that we cannot use to address water shortages. And below 60 billion cubic meter, Egypt has a drought management policy, which activate when we are below the level of 60 billion cubic meter. It has been activated before from 1978 to 1987 during the drought time, and it's basically sending less water by 5% or by 10% or more downstream the HD. So to these challenges of the high inner consumption, and it adds the damming upstream in the Nile, and the Djerd is the new large dam being constructed upstream in the Nile, and when finished, it will store 74 billion cubic meter. And so between Djerd and the Aswan High Dam, the Nile, you have about 280% of the annual flow, which is controlled by these two dams. So we have a totally engineered river, and we have no more the signature of the natural flow for both. And the same reason Ethiopia is constructing the Djerd are the same reason Egypt is constructing the Aswan High Dam, generate electricity, better management of water resources, better management of the drought, etc. So water resources in Egypt. So again, the Nile is the biggest source of water resources in Egypt. You have the groundwater, it's just a fraction, so it's 2.5 billion cubic meter. And then you have minor amount of rain and the wastewater treatment, which is here. And of course, all of this and the agricultural wastewater, so the reuse of the wastewater, and all of that add to about 80 billion cubic meter of water budget. Now, the Nile provide this 55.5. Any decrease in the Nile means that you will have to increase one of these. Okay? And if you increase any one of these, there are issues. So for instance, let's look, if you increase the agriculture wastewater, if you have to turn the water more cycles for irrigation, your water contamination is higher, so your contaminant level is higher, and the water become slightly toxic, and there are health issues associated with that. If you increase your deep groundwater, so your deep groundwater and your shallow groundwater is not renewable, so you are losing your strategic water reserve to mitigate the droughts. So all of these issues become problematic, and this is why the impacts of damming upstream is taken very seriously, because it is not about the volume only, how much Egypt can lose, but it's about the implication on health and implication on economy and agriculture that might do to compensate the loss amount. So Egypt is for sure, it's a bad student in the school. It's consumed a lot of water. It has very weak water conservation programs, that's for sure. And it keeps increasing its water consumption to an amount that is very difficult to sustain. And this is from a paper by Nikki and Fatah Al-Tahir, which they show in this blue line here is the future projected water use. So it goes to 200 billion cubic meter, and that's that's the total amount of water available for the Nile. So you see, as we shift from the modern area where we are here, where the deficit is basically 30 billion cubic meter, in the future we're going to shifting to bigger deficit. So how we're going to fill that gap of water we need requires science, require engineering, require efficient water management, that we have to work on it here. So in the next decade, there is no substitute that water research, water management become the top priority of the nation. So the impact of the GERD, so we have heard everything from people say, oh, there is no impact, the dam is transparent, to more, I would say more black scenarios, more dangerous one. And so something very important that we'd like to highlight where this is coming from. Some unfortunately attribute this, it's Egypt versus Ethiopia, and it's not true. There are two visions, true, one that say that the dam has no impact, and one that the dam has impact, but deep inside of them, they are not nation related. They are related to the vision by which people look to damming. Civil engineers look to damming as a marvel of engineering that can resolve water management, generate electricity, which is partially true. Environmental researchers and geologists, they look to the impacts of these dams. So for instance, the Aswan High Dam, the impact it generated on the agricultural area, on the degradation of the Nile Delta, on the reduction of the biodiversity in the Nile, in 6 decades, it was dramatic. So yes, Egyptians have seen the impacts of large dams, and this is why they have some concerns on big dams. It's not because it's an Ethiopian dam. If the dam was Sudanese, wouldn't Egyptian be less concerned? All of these things are untrue, and unfortunately these messages keep going around social media by scientists, and it's saddening because it doesn't help to resolve the problem. So the impact of the dam, again, is related to how much rain will flow in the basin, how much years will fill the reservoir, how much electricity should be generated, and the storage that exists in the Aswan High Dam during the filling of that. So in our latest research, we clearly explained that what's the contribution of the filling of the dam. We didn't say the operation. So the filling of the dam will add to the current water budget deficit in Egypt, will add 9.5 billion cubic meter plus 2.5 billion cubic meters. So we're talking roughly about 12 billion cubic meter that will adds up to already to the unmitigated water budget deficit. So summing up the water budget deficit in Egypt on average to 31 billion cubic meter if there is no mitigation. And here we separated, so this is the amount of the water budget deficit we have. Now, a big part of that is mitigated through many ways, as we show here, through the operation of HD, through groundwater extraction, through the crop selection, through wastewater. But the importance of understanding the size of our deficit without mitigation, because mitigation is an economic exercise. There is no free mitigation, okay? And so if this has a very important economic value, so our water budget deficit, the value of that deficit translated in economic numbers, we're talking about roughly $51 billion over 3 years, so about $17.5 billion a year, if of course we have the maximum loss during the filling of the dam. So $17 billion is the value of the rough value of your water budget deficit. So this is why having a good water management practice, having a good scientific research on impact of climate change on the Nile Basin can save us this money and can better use it into mitigating this. So when we publish these numbers, the idea is not to freak out people, because people in our area do not, that water doesn't, that's not what make people scared. And people are scared of many things. So we're not adding one of them on the top of whatever they are scared of. We're just highlighting that this should be a top priority in the budget expenditure. So that's basically all I have, and I'm very eager to listen to Dr. Amr and see his vision on how we should change the politics to mitigate this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan, and that was very informative. I think even I have questions. Now, please, Dr. Hamzawi, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Marlene, and thank you so much, Hassan, for an excellent presentation. I share Marlene's view. It's been very, very informative and forward-looking, which is exactly what we need. So let me start by telling you what I'm proposing to do, and in a way, it's a great panel structure, because having the science coming first, which should always be the case, makes great sense. And to follow up after Assam has introduced the scientific background in what he called the simplistic way, but I guess for laymen and women like Marlene and myself who are not scientists, it's not that simplistic. So, but having you introducing the science component gives me a great place to start. So let me start by saying that I would like to share primarily a couple of points regarding climate change in general in the Middle East and North Africa, to situate the situation and the context in Egypt in a wider regional context in the MENA region in the Middle East and North Africa. Secondly, to have a couple of reflections on governance and water resources and what has been going on in this field from a governance perspective. Thirdly, to highlight how climate change interacts with governance and vulnerability to increase vulnerability and to change the map of vulnerable communities in our part of the world in a way which adds to the economic and financial burden you, Assam, have just outlined, with a 60, if I recall the figure correctly, a 60 additional billion that we have to come up with, or we could save if we do better. And the final point I will be making is, once again, forward-looking, and how we can find ways to do what is called now worldwide climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So let me start by telling you that in the Middle East and North Africa, we are looking at maybe the region, that one region in the world which is worst hit by climate change. The region is predicted to have an increase in temperature by 4 degrees Celsius by 2050, making parts of the region, different parts of the region, uninhabitable. For example, the southern part of Iraq, the eastern southern part of Iran, different places in North Africa and the Algerian desert, different places in Morocco, in Tunisia and Libya and Egypt. We are looking at a region, even if worldwide we get to fulfill our global goals with regard to reducing emissions, carbon emissions, and we meet the obligations which governments of the world set in different binding international treaties and protocols. Even if we meet the environmental objectives, the Middle East and North Africa will still be hit very hard by climate change. That increase in temperature comes again as the background of a set of additional and complicating factors. One of them, Assam alluded to, which is water scarcity. And Assam was very accurate in saying Egypt has the toughest water scarcity crisis looming large in the background, but other countries do have. There is no single Middle East and North African country which does not face water scarcity, from Morocco to Bahrain and to Iran. And secondly, you have a demographic, you have patterns of demographic growth, which are quite complicating as well. I mean, we have populations in the region which are increasing at a higher level than most other regions of the world, and that pattern of demographic growth means that available resources, be it water resources or other resources, are going to be distributed among more citizens, which makes it even tougher. A third complicating factor is the food insecurity. And all of us have come to realize, in the region have come to realize, how we can be very hard hit by food insecurity once the supply chains get disrupted or once food prices spike. We're seeing the impact of the Russian war on Ukraine and the spike in prices in wheat. And then we woke up to a reality where every single Middle Eastern and North African country has been importing its wheat primarily from Russia and Ukraine. Egypt imports 85% of its wheat primarily from Russia and Ukraine. Egypt is the world's largest importer of wheat. And with the increase in food insecurity, with the increase in food prices, we're facing a tough situation. A fourth and last additional factor is the emerging drought. Assam referred to the drought in Ethiopia in the Nile Basin in the 1970s and 1980s. But right now, as of today, Morocco and Syria, and both of them used to be agricultural countries, have been facing a drought for several years, impacting their agricultural production, impacting their water resources, adding to their water scarcity. So in a way, my first point is, if you take a Middle Eastern and North African prism, we are looking at a region which is predicted to be one of the worst regions hit by climate change in the next years. And there is a set of factors at play, and their interplay makes it very difficult for governments and populations in the region to manage the impacts of climate change. The second point I would like to make is with regard to water resources, and here I will sort of move from the broader regional context into the Egyptian setting, and in doing so, going to the Nile Basin, the question of the distribution of water resources. Let me start by adding to some of the points Assam was making. The question is not whether it's, and of course I'm speaking as an Egyptian, but I'm also speaking as a political scientist interested in development, and as someone who recognizes the right of the Ethiopian people to find a path, a safe path, and I have to say a safe environmental path to social and economic sustainable development. Assam was right in mentioning that we in Egypt experimented with building dams. We benefited to an extent. We suffered to an extent. We know what the process with the different upsides and downsides are. And it's not about denying the Ethiopian people the right to build a dam and to find a safe path to economic and social development. The question is whether that is being done in an internationally legitimate fashion, in an internationally balanced fashion, because at the end of the day, the Nile is not an Ethiopian resource. We are looking at a multi-country river, and multi-country rivers, and we do have a set of regulations in international law, a set of binding treaties, in fact, and even a set of agreements between Nile countries stipulating that this is not a national resource. This is a resource which is shared, and the use of the resource by any one of the countries, be it upstream or downstream, has to be in accordance with international binding regulations, and without the one golden rule is without inflicting damage on the rights of others. So the question of JERD is not a question of whether it's the right of Ethiopians or not. The question is how to make sure that the practice of the legitimate right of Ethiopians to build dams and to produce and to generate energy and to find the safe path to economic and social development does not inflict harm on downstream countries, primarily Sudan and Egypt, because in doing so, that is a violation of international law, and in doing so, that is a violation of the different binding agreements that were signed globally and were signed between different Nile countries. And I believe we've been, from an Egyptian perspective, we've been in a waiting situation, seeing the Ethiopian side pushing forward a set of unilateral steps. I would say renegating on previous obligations, not accepting the binding nature of signed agreements, and here we are facing the specter of the third filling of the dam, which impacts Sudanese and Egyptian resources, of course, always in relation to, as Assam mentioned, to how much rain will fall, and it's always when you look long term, medium term, and long term. But there are some impacts which are immediate, and there are some impacts which make Egypt, the most populous country in the Middle East and North Africa, worry about the future of its water resources, especially against the background of the water scarcity that Assam mentioned. We have an existing deficit that is projected to increase even if we keep the current water resources unchanged, which is quite challenged due to the building of the Ethiopian dam. Besides this point, the dam itself brings in the specter of environmental hazards as well. And of course, I will let Assam speak about that. I mean, he is a scientist, but from my layman readings, I do know that there are additional environmental hazards related to the building of the dam that can impact Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, and every other single Nile country. So what I'm calling for right here is, and without denying the significance of the governance of water use, which I will come to speak about, and rationalizing it in a way which makes our use in every country in the Middle East and North Africa, and every country in the Nile Basin more efficient of existing water resources, without denying the importance of the governance and the rational use of water resources. The situation that has been evolving due to the building of JERD needs to be addressed, and needs to be addressed in a negotiable fashion, in a multilateral negotiable fashion, where the Ethiopian side comes to a binding agreement with the two most impacted, potentially damaged countries in terms of their water resources, Sudan and Egypt. So we need a binding agreement that is upheld, and we need some regional and international guarantees from an Egyptian perspective. Now, the use of water in Egypt, and I do agree with Assam, and before coming to the panel, I've been reading a bit about how efficient, how inefficient our use of water resources has evolved in Egypt in the last decades. We are still far away from using our water resources efficiently. We are still wasting a lot due to the persistence of traditional ways of irrigation, due to the, I would say, partial persistence of traditional ways of irrigation, due to additional elements which have been quite dominant in the population behavior vis-a-vis using water, especially in urban cities. However, the government has embarked on the path of trying to improve the efficiency of water resources. We're still not there yet, but there are some interesting projects going on between the government and Egypt and different European counterparts, between Egypt and the EU, between Egypt and the World Bank. So we're trying to increase efficiency and to increase the reuse of water while factoring in the important point Assam made about contamination and contamination levels, and what happens to groundwater resources. So there is no denying that Egypt needs to improve its efficiency when it comes to the use of water resources, and the question of GERD should not be a question posed across a spectrum of theses and antitheses. So it's either you are for it or against it. Now, the question is not that Egypt is not using its water resources efficiently, and therefore they should not put forward the claim regarding GERD. That is only a partial truth, and the partial truth is that we have to improve our efficiency in using water resources. That does not mean that we have to accept the potential damage or the potential impact of GERD on our water resources and the environmental hazards it presents. And there's a lot going on right now while we are approaching the third filling in terms of the safety and stability of the dam and its potential impact, and that needs and warrants a scientific discussion, not a politicized discussion, but a scientific discussion based on the stipulations of international law and international legality. Let me now move into sort of more of what can we do beside hopefully finding a binding implementation of existing agreements with the Ethiopian partner, increasing our efficiency when it comes to water resources. From a governance perspective, there are 4 additional points which need to be taken into consideration. 1, climate change, water scarcity, food insecurity, rising temperatures, rising sea levels do mean for Middle Eastern and North African countries a changed map of vulnerable communities. Some communities, I mean, the traditional vulnerable communities in our region have been migrants, ethnic and religious minorities, poor and impoverished segments of the population. Now, with climate change, we are adding new vulnerable groups. We have farmers who are losing their livelihood in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. We have urban communities which can no longer live as they used to live in a place like Iraq or in a place like Iran or in different Gulf countries due to the deteriorated climate conditions, rising temperatures, and so on and so forth. We, in fact, because of the restraints water scarcity is imposing on governments, because of the restraints food insecurity is imposing on the government, governments need to devote more resources to finding enough water, to finding enough food, and that takes away from what governments have been planning to spend on poverty alleviation, on social safety schemes, on developmental schemes in general. So we come to see a region away from oil exporting countries, a region in economic and financial distress in general, where resources which have been already quite slim, quite meager in terms of managing long-lasting crises, are being deviated and shifted into a mode of firefighting. Here we have to increase water resources by one way or another, or we have to get the wheat which we have to import, where prices tripled over the last few months, impacting, for example, the budget of Egypt in 2022, adding $1 billion to the government expenses to get exactly the same amount of wheat due to the price projected to be over $2 billion in 2023 next year. So what that stress, which is related to climate change, food insecurity, and additional climatic factors, is restraining governments and pushing them away from doing long-term or even medium-term economic and social developmental schemes, and pushing them into a firefighting mode, which is quite dangerous from a sustainable development perspective. The second point is that in a way, I mean, we come from a very unlucky region. We have not been the heavy producers of carbon emissions worldwide. I mean, the Middle East produces per capita, if I'm not mistaken, this is the second least region producing per capita emissions. If you compare it to the heavy emission producing places in North America, in Europe, as well as in different places in Asia. So we have not, in a way, we have not contributed to the current crisis of climate change, but we are suffering from it. And therefore, it's quite important to look, and we're looking ahead at COP27 hosted by Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh in November 2022, COP28 hosted by the United Arab Emirates in the following year. In a way, in the region, I mean, there are some interesting discussions going on, especially after the last two COPs, that this region needs a balancing act. I mean, we need some developmental help in addressing how to do climate in doing climate adaptation and climate mitigation properly, especially in countries which lack financial resources and economic and financial means. There are two champions when it comes to climate mitigation and climate adaptation in the region, and those are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, followed by other Gulf countries. And you can see clearly where this is coming from. I mean, these are countries which do not face budget deficits in the way Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Syria, Iraq are facing them. And so we need some mitigation and adaptation schemes promoted by the international community, since we are predicted to be more hit than any other region in the world. The final point I would like to make is, once again, I'm looking forward in terms of mitigating climate change impacts, in terms of mitigating the question of water scarcity, and factoring in the two components of better management of existing water resources, protecting a fair distribution of water resources in the Nile Basin and in other rivers, by the way. It's not only the Nile, which is relevant from a Middle Eastern perspective. We have the triangle of Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, where multi-country, multi-state rivers are contested as well, and no fair distribution can be said to be happening there. So beside these two components, I strongly believe that the region needs to find a strategic commitment, be it the region, the references to the Middle East and North Africa, or to the Nile Basin, a strategic commitment to cooperation, a strategic commitment to no zero-sum games fight. GERD should not be constructed as a zero-sum game. And because if it's constructed as a zero-sum game, the danger, the prospects of damage are huge for everyone, including for the Ethiopian side as well. It needs to be constructed as a win-win situation, and it's not that difficult to do. Of course, scientists have to speak, but from my layman observations, if we manage to find a balanced distribution of the water resources, on the Ethiopian side, the filling of the dam in a gradual fashion, which does not impact the resources of Sudan and Egypt, which does not lead to them facing the specter of a severe water scarcity situation, that can be constructed as a win-win situation where economic development is pushed forward, sustainable social development is pushed forward, and we move away from the zero-sum game that has been preoccupying us in the last couple of years. So far from me, let me stop here, and I would be very, very happy to take your questions.
Many thanks, Dr. Amr. It's really great to have the insight. One of the things also I would like to mention, it's the issues of upstream damming, whether GERD or other dam, is not only the filling, but it's also the operation. What happens if you go to drought and then the GERD is not filled, the GERD is at the dead storage, and the Aswan High Dam, which at the dead storage. How we manage these times of when we go to drought. So any dams require not only collaboration, it's obvious, but also require the studies so that we can understand these risks. And of course, nobody should wait forever for these studies to happen. But I believe that a minimum of studies should have been made, and it was generated actually after that. We've seen the studies on the deficit that can be caused by GERD appeared in 2020. So 8 years after we start constructing the dam, and amazingly these studies show, okay, there is no issue. So what I'm seeing from the outside, something we haven't studied, and then has no I mean, and when we started, showed that it has no impact. So these things need to change. But also, I would like to say that in the 50s, when Egypt was constructing the Aswan High Dam, there was a minister of agriculture, an expert at that time. His name is Professor Wagdi, and he was in Stanford University. He was an Egyptian Stanford University, and he warned, so where you are right now, Dr. Amr, and he warned against the degradation of the Nile Delta in 1950s. Today, 70 years after what he said, we have Alexandria is sinking because of the degradation of the delta, which is due to the lack of sediment transport, which is blocked by the Aswan High Dam. So we should never ridiculize or minimize or ignore the voices, because we are a populous nation. And so because we are a populous nation, every impact is amplified by two things. First, we are the high population. Second, our low technical readiness to address these. And the third, if I may add, that also we don't have as part of the priority of the leadership or the country leadership to tackle climate change. So we have other priority, which is totally understandable. But what we are calling that this should become the priority. This is the fight we cannot ignore, and this is the fight, if we don't do, we will vanish. I mean the fight against climate change and water scarcity.
Thank you both. This was absolutely fascinating, but I don't want to leave it at a distress level. I think you were both relatively optimistic, while and I think the zero-sum game that Dr. Hamzawi mentioned is an extremely important concept. But okay, so where do we start now? Now we know that right now there is the third filling of the dam. Where do we start? If you were responsible, what exactly would you do with a high population, with a weak water management capabilities? Where would you start?
So Marlene, if I may say so, the third filling of the dam or the fourth and the upcoming ones, they're not really an alarming things, because the filling is happening at low rate right now because of the technical readiness of the dam to store water is low. They have in this phase, it is expected that the dam will fill to about 13 billion cubic meter. So this is about 20% roughly of the volume of the water in the dam. So the dam hasn't been filled yet to its maximum capacity. So they start to raise flags about the concern. But this is why we haven't seen impacts, because we haven't been filling the dam at the level where it is expected, at least for the first two filling. The first one is small fill. The second one is another small fill. This third one should be a larger one, and it is happening during the wet season. So hopefully this wet season will be collaborating with our friends in Ethiopia, and then they will be able to fill with a lot of excess of rain. And so I think where we should be looking at not just how we can get more water, but how we can maximize our efficiency. And why don't we take Los Angeles, the city where I live, as an example? And when it increased its population 3 times, from 3 million to 11 million, but it didn't increase its water consumption, because there is an army of scientists and engineers who keep the city hydrated. And we need that army of scientists and engineers to do that. But when you look very closely, we have a large volume of water scientists and water engineers, including myself, who are abroad, who left. And there is a younger generation who's leaving. We have the same problem with doctors, where the nation is so the immigration of brains, the brain drain, increase the country vulnerability into any of these, I would say, water stress, environmental hazards, the disease issues. So the real question is, how can we keep the talents inside? In all Africa, this is happening everywhere. I mean, it's happening in Ethiopia, it's happening in Egypt, it happened in Sudan. I mean, you have the best environmental scientists on the planet would be coming from Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, and they are in the US, from MIT to Caltech to NASA to other universities, so in Colorado. And so what now, and what is the, and how we can proceed with this further? And that's, I think, is one major question we need to address.
If I may add to your question, Marlene. So I believe it's very important to tackle short-term risks as short-term risks, and to have sort of a clear timeline differentiation in mind between short-term risks and medium-term and long-term risks. So I couldn't agree more with Assam on how brain drain adds to countries' vulnerabilities. And it's not only a Middle East and North Africa issue, it's an Africa issue. It's a global South issue where we are in Los Angeles or at Stanford or where you are, Marlene, or in any European academic institution, you see great minds, women and men, who left their countries seeking better opportunities to advance their careers, to do their scientific research, or to engage in academic communities where freedom of expression and academic freedoms are upheld. And of course, where socioeconomically life is better than the global South, where our societies have been facing long-seated social and economic crises impacting levels of income and living conditions and so on and so forth. So yes, from a medium and long-term perspective, it's great to look at the Los Angeles experiment. I mean, I lived the last year in the Bay Area, in the northern part of California, facing a drought, not as severe as the southern part of California, but yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Assam. There's an army of engineers and bioscientists and scientists keeping the city hydrated and keeping our water consumption at lower levels. So we need to emulate these models, and for that, for us in the Middle East and North Africa and in Africa, to be able to emulate them, we need international cooperation schemes, which is why I'm very much looking forward to COP27, see what kind of international schemes will be emerging out of it to do mitigation adaptation with regard to water resources, with regard to biodiversity in different ways. But at the short term, I believe the short-term risks we're facing in Sudan and Egypt as downstream countries, and while putting in context the feeling, the way Assam said, which is very revealing to me, that it's done gradually. However, we are facing at the short-term level the specter of declining, receding water resources, and that needs to be addressed. And the only way to do it in the short term, while we are pursuing medium-term and long-term plans to improve our efficiency, to improve our use of water, is to come to a binding implementation of the agreements between Egypt, Sudan on the one hand, and Ethiopia on the other hand. So we need to know how the filling is happening. We need to know what the technical dangers are. We need to have a real set of tools to communicate between the three countries without hiding information, how to share information and share facts properly, how to recreate trust between the three countries in order to move forward. So at the short term, we need a negotiational framework to re-establish trust, and for Egypt and Sudan to know what's happening and to quieten at least some of their legitimate fears, because that's what's on everyone's mind. Improving efficiency in managing our water resources, improving schemes to international and regional cooperation schemes to get around climate change, to address climate change, will take time. finally, I guess a key point, and which is why this panel is great, which is why it would be very important to do it in Arabic as well, we need to raise awareness about climate change. Our region, the Middle East and North Africa, and Africa, in fact, as a continent, we have a history of missing it. I mean, we wake up very late to what's going on. We woke up very late to food insecurity. Everyone outside of the Middle East and North Africa, even in rich Europe. I mean, I remember a statement by the German Chancellor Merkel saying, well, we are going to face food insecurity, a statement 6-7 years ago. We woke up after the Russian war on Ukraine. We wake up to existential crises relatively late. So that needs to be addressed. We have to create awareness, to raise awareness about climate change and address it, because it impacts not only our livelihood, it impacts governance, it impacts development, it impacts politics, it impacts societies. So that needs to be addressed.
In terms of international binding agreements, haven't we reached a sort of dead end now regarding GERD?
I don't think we are in a dead end. I think more people are not listening because the situation is looked at as a matter of,
yeah, it's a conflict.
I think both parties, so people are looking to the GERD issue and Egypt water share, from both parties, it is looking at from the sovereignty perspective, that this is my water, my sense, and then people start to think in a common sense way, and science doesn't work with common sense. That's at least what we learned from Galileo about 300 years ago. It worked with data and observations. So you can't use your common sense, it's raining in my place, so it's mine. I mean, then we can have the island of Socotra in Yemen to claim the Nile to be there because it's coming from the water evaporation on their territory too. And then we can go farther that this water is coming from Thailand, and then we can go farther down the road if we take it in this way. I don't think we need common sense. I think we need observations, and we need people to put their emotion for one side, because there is, in Africa, and like any place, we have learned the lesson that when we are happy together. When we suffer together. I don't know a single nation in Africa who have a prosperity and a booming economy which is neighbor being very poor and the inverse. There are some cases, but this has caused instabilities, immigration, etc., etc. So the Nile Basin, we need to resolve our problem as collectively, not only sharing water, but also how we use that water. So we can't just agree on sharing and don't agree on the consumption. There are consumption scenarios we need to agree on collectively. There are education scenarios we need to agree on it collectively, and population, the growth of population also we need to agree it on collectively. So how much we can grow collectively. So we can't. So it is not about the sovereignty, and so it's my land, I do whatever I want. This is apply for Egypt, for Sudan, or Ethiopia. No, it is our lives. And it will, and now we realize that whether we're going to be living together or whether, I don't know what is the alternative. To be honest, I really do not know. But also why Egypt, there is a fear also on upstream damming, not only a specific dam, because we've seen in Iraq, Digla and Furat, what's happening. We've seen both rivers quietly disappearing beyond the dams in Syria. And the latest change in the river flow showed a little island where there is some archaeological discoveries that were found there. So people are seeing in the area these things happening. So they have concerns. And these concerns, again, very similar to Los Angeles, can be resolved if we don't take the things emotionally, if we don't take the things as a matter of sovereignty. It's very easily said than done, but there is no escape from doing that.
Okay.
If I may
Please.
add a point,
Yeah, please.
Marlene, on the sovereignty issue. I mean, and bringing in sort of my background as a political scientist. I mean, in established international law regulations and stipulations pertaining to multi-country rivers, water as a resource is not up for sovereign claims for any individual side. It's not. Sovereignty is limited in multi-country Nile river settings, including the Nile Basin. So let's leave aside that populist note of our water, our resource. I guess it's for domestic consumption in Ethiopia primarily, because the government knows very well that there are binding international law regulations that do control what happens. Secondly, we have a set of agreements, and I believe your question was going in this direction, because we've signed agreements, including a memorandum of understanding, a memorandum on joint principles. And the one major principle is you can use your resources, you can use the resource in your territory without damaging others. And especially this becomes quite key in upstream and downstream situations. Ethiopia is upstream, Sudan and Egypt are downstream, as Assam mentioned several times. So you have to implement the principle of impacting no damage on the other. And this is not a question about quotas and who gets how much in terms of water resources. It's about not impacting the livelihood. If Egypt falls under a specific amount of water resources, our livelihood in Egypt is impacted, and that needs to be addressed. Finally, I believe the only way forward is exactly to treat it as a non-zero-sum game, as to come to a win-win situation. How water is distributed in the Nile Basin, and you have to factor in developmental needs, but you have to factor in population needs as well. I mean, Ethiopia and Egypt happen to be population strong. The two countries have over 100 million inhabitants. How to factor in their needs, how to factor in their legitimate developmental needs, and how to find collective schemes with the help of the international community and regional frameworks like the African Union, for example, to come to cooperation. We've wasted a lot of time in sort of in fighting over right or wrong. And unfortunately, part of it was related or has been related to the absence of information and fact sharing. You cannot build trust in a system if you hide, if you deny information, if you do not engage in a dialogue, if you do not engage in, as we say, even in a lay women and men fashion, in an upfront communication. We need to know what's going on. You need to make Egypt and Sudan part of it without seeing your sovereignty impacted. I mean, that's a populist note that the Ethiopian side has to come away from. I believe Sudan and Egypt have been saying, their government saying, let's push for cooperation once and again. And now it's time maybe for international mediation, for regional mediation to kick in one more time. But these are the short-term risks which we have to address to assure that the water scarcity, the crisis, does not get compounded by additional factors. And then we come into sort of medium-term and long-term management together and collective schemes for development, while not ignoring, which is the topic of our panel, climate change at large, because it's way more than water distress and water scarcity. We are impacted in many different ways.
Yes.
Okay, I have a question here from somebody. I think we answered some of it, but was Egypt wrong in signing any agreement with Ethiopia? And is Sisi right in his approach with Ethiopia?
I can't comment on that because I'm totally focused on the part which is on the science part. So I have no really answer. I mean, I think what is right and wrong depend on the science. We've seen the papers that claim that there is no impacts. So there are three types of papers. Papers who claim there is no impacts, and papers like ours who claim that there is impact, and papers who said that if we do sophisticated collaboration agreements, we can mitigate the impacts. Okay, but in the end, a month ago, the head of the JERD project, in an interview with Arabia Station, he clearly recognized for the first time in 10 years, it's the first Ethiopian official to recognize that there might be impact for the dam. This are big change from the 10 years that there is no impacts, no impacts, no impacts. So we're seeing changes. And we are not trying to find these impacts, again, to point fingers or that to say, okay, now we have these impacts. That's a childish way. And unfortunately, there is a lobby behind this childish vision, which we come to encounter. We first believe that we are looking to individual, to the scientists who are unhappy. Then we come to say, no, this is a well-organized lobby presenting itself as science, but it's a lobby. And but it's very important to understand that we need to assess the impact so that we can be ready for them. If we do the similar way to the Aswan High Dam in the 1950s, where the impacts were pointed out, and then they were diminished in 2020, Alexandria is sinking. Okay, I'm not saying we will have the same impacts, but there are impacts we need to study. They are due to the change in sedimentation, they are due to change in biodiversity, the ecology, change in the rain precipitation in the basin. All of these things we need to know because it impacts 300 million people's life. We don't diminish them, okay? Don't act that you're superior on others. So, oh, I know things you don't know. I have the magic ball, which is called this software, and we put data in it and we get this. Because the truth is, when we look to data the repeatability of a lot of these publications, the main publication that claim that there is no impact, I mean, we had issue. The data was not repeatable. They took one period of time. They say, if we build the dam during that period, and this would be the flow change, and you see there is no impact. Well, if you take it on other average period, you see that there is impacts. So, so it's not about having something published to point finger at the others. It's about trying to reach together as close as to the truth. And in a week, we will have our reply to a comment submitted by this group and to the critiques to our work, and I'm very happy it's going to be published. And we are honestly shocked to see such comment with such severe problem, to see such, I would say, superficial understanding of where are the impacts we see in our work. But in all case, we just seen the first water science lobby, the first water lobby. It's now here. It's now established fact. It is on this matter, and now I think journals and other people and the media, they know it, which before wasn't established as a case. We've seen the lobbying in other fields, like in medical research, in food production, but we never seen in water. So this is the first case at this scale, of course, and that need to change.
Dr. Hamzawi, do you have a comment?
Sure. Yes. I mean, I've been pushing forward in my remarks, and in fact, I've been doing that in my press writings. I happen to have a weekly spot in the Arabic language newspaper of Quds Al Arabi, in which I wrote a couple of times about JERD and the question of water resources in the Nile Basin. So I will not say, or I will not push forward an opinion different than what I did already write. No, I am convinced that signing memorandums of understanding, signing different treaties and agreements, as long as you always stipulate in the respective treaty or agreement the international law binding principles of this is not a sovereign resource of any one country. Being upstream does not mean that you can control its flow and the amount of what your neighbors get. And as long as you have a stipulation of the no damage principle, do not impact damage on others, which once again, I mean, I was addressing Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, and Assam did the same. I mean, we have, unfortunately, worst case practices in the Middle East and North Africa. And right now, a challenging situation is emerging in the Nile Basin, but we have best case practices in Europe. And different. I mean, Europe has so many rivers which are multi-country rivers, and we have been organized upstream and downstream, and dam building has been organized in the 1950s, and we have in fact binding European agreements which can be taken as sort of I wouldn't say a blueprint, but as sort of an they offer an interesting orientation to fashion multilateral agreements which do not impact anyone's rights. So no, I am in favor of signing collective agreements, but we have to come to collective implementation, collective binding implementation of what was signed, because the question now, Marlene, is not to sign a new agreement, it's basically to implement what has been already signed. And part of what needs to be implemented is information sharing, fact sharing. You cannot hide information on impacts, on dangers, on risks from partners in the same basin, which can be impacted in an existential fashion. You cannot sort of go to negotiation rounds, and I'm referring to the Ethiopian side, sort of having that populist discourse being pushed forward, my water, it's not. So we need to come away from this and find to sort of a way of in a binding fashion to implement already signed agreements before signing any new agreement.
And usually when an agreement is signed, it should also say that it shouldn't be, nothing in this agreement should contradict international prior binding agreements. So yes. All right. So we talked about the river. We have just a little bit of time left, but we talked about the river. What about the shore? What is happening? I mean, you mentioned Dr. Assam, you mentioned Alexandria. What is happening to that entire seashore?
So in addition to water scarcity, we have another monster, which is the sea level rise. Of course, in the Nile Delta, we see the evidence of coastal erosion, which will make sea level rise worse. This means that our coasts are eroding, so our vulnerability to sea level rise will increase. And so a lot of the coast we see disappearing in Egypt are results of the Aswan High Dam, not really resulting of sea level rise, but people confuse both. But as the sea level are rising, so as our coast getting eroded, the smallest impact of sea level rise is becoming more visible. And also the vulnerability to the storms become higher. This is why every winter in Alexandria, we see these seawater intrusion inside the city, and the city become inundated. It is not that the sea has rising, it's your wall of defense against the storm have disappeared. Your beaches are disappearing. So we still have another battle, which is the battle of sea level rise. We have the battle of increase in desertification. So all of these battles, I think one of the major weakness from political perspective in Egypt, that decision makers, because they see the scientists are not conclusive about it, so they say, oh, you guys are not conclusive, so whenever you are, come to me. And we are not conclusive about the magnitude, but we are conclusive about the trends. Yes, the sea are rising, whether they are rising 1 centimeter per year or 1.5 centimeter per year, that's where the disaccord is. But they are rising. And so, and decision makers also need, there is a disbelief in science. We have in our system in Egypt and in the Middle East. And the disbelief in science have its roots that the science is coming from universities. And people in universities like Amr and myself, they are always perceived as troublemakers, or they are perceived as oppositions. So why me as a decision maker, I would believe in opposition. And that is why science has been always behind. And that is why whenever they need science, the government in all over Africa, they go to environmental consultation companies. They don't go to their institutions. And of course, these companies are as good as the data they have their hands on, and as good as how much the time they spend to understand the complexity of the project. So before we discuss about having trust between nations, we need also to talk about the trust inside of our own nations. We need to trust the scientists. We need to trust the politicians. We need to trust the decision makers. There is a circle of trust that is broken, and is primarily broken because we are the decision makers are looking for 100% alignment to a vision, and science doesn't know 100% alignment. Art doesn't know these alignments. So it is crucial to the prosperity of the nation that our decision lives with a minimum level of disaccord with the science community and the intellectual community and the political community, because that minimum level of disaccord help us to question ourselves. And when we question ourselves, we protect ourselves. And without this, we lose our way. If we are all 100% going to this direction, I mean, total obedience is the receipt for disaster. I mean, and this is the problem between science and politics we have to fix.
And I think this is the problem that a lot of people are feeling, that that we don't have a say in what is going on in the governance. And so this becomes a problem. Okay, what do I do as an individual to help mitigate this disaster that is looming? And people feel that they don't have a way to do that because they're not part of the decision-making and part of the governance. Dr. Amr, you mentioned 4 degrees centigrade. This is huge. This is a huge rise. It has major impacts not only on the sea level and on the shores. It's a big change, I think.
It is. And just like rising sea levels, as Assam was mentioning, and I mentioned in my introductory remarks, rising temperatures, rising sea levels are increasing to the composition of our vulnerable communities. I mean, people are losing their livelihood in different Mediterranean countries on our side. I mean, Tunisia and Algeria are prime examples, Egypt as well. I mean, the reference to Alexandria. And rising temperatures are turning sub-regions in the Middle East and North Africa to uninhabitable regions. I mean, southern Iraq had recorded 50 degrees Celsius last summer. Over a longer period of time. I mean, some can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I was reading, sort of in my overall observation. So yes, I mean that is a set of additional dangerous phenomena which are emerging. We do not have the luxury of time of pushing them around with the pretext of science is inconclusive. So Assam is totally right. I mean, so trends are clear. However, I mean, let me say, because we live in the US, where questions of climate change are highly contested as well, where, I mean, it's not only a global South phenomenon. So it really comes down to what the respective polity turns out in terms of consensus building, Marlene, in terms of inclusion of different groups of the population or exclusion of them. What is dominant? I mean, we live in the US where for some segments of the population, climate change is not to be taken seriously, right. Just like coronavirus, just like the pandemic. I mean, unfortunately, again, the background of very solid scientific facts, in an advanced society like the US, you still have climate change denial strategies going on and pursued by someone like the former President Donald Trump and pursued as of now by wide segments in his Republican Party. And so in a way that climate change denial is not only related to the global south, it's a wider question. And the tensions between science and politics really go back all the way to old civilizations up until today. And it comes down to, can we, and here's where freedom of expression and academic freedoms matter. Can we do this panel and get Assam to speak up, and get you to speak up, and get me to speak up? And can we sort of hope for politicians listening and paying attention to what we're saying, or to what they find useful in what we're saying? That is sort of the challenge we're facing. But climate change denial is happening everywhere, maybe less in Europe, maybe less in some countries in Asia, where that has come to be conventional wisdom and mainstream thinking. But even in the US, where we live, it's not. And in different places like Brazil, yes. Take Brazil as an example, or different African countries. So it's a fight, it's a constant fight, it's a constant struggle to bring knowledge and information and facts forward, and to get politics to follow suit. But historically speaking, politics or political spheres are always slow. They are never up to speed with science. They take a way longer time. And that's part of the hassle we've been facing as humanity in the last decades and centuries.
Very true. Dr. Hegyi, you wanted to comment? No?
Yes, I mean, having served as a science advisor of the president for a year, of course, I've seen how science is considered as luxury, and sometimes we go to this game where we call the chaotic scene we live in as a science. So people would explain to you that all these chaotic scenes are a science, which you don't know how it works, and they know how it works. Unfortunately, I want to say to something maybe to conclude my comment, that if we are as scientists, decision makers, the public, if we can't put our hands hand in hand, we will not resolve the water issue. Water issue is the only issue that cannot be resolved by a one-man decision. It has to have the population as part of it, because population are the consumer, they are the polluter, they are the saver of the water. So it's not a one-man decision. We need to really, this is a good exercise for us to rally about this one thing, which is water preservation, and not just requesting more water, and move forward with that. And I'm really hopeful we can do it. We can do it. Egypt can do it. Africa can do it. Africa might be poor. Africa might be divided, but Africa is not blind to see the risk that is coming next. And I'm hopeful that the continent will be able to see this risk and work on it.
Thank you very much to both of you. This was very informative and very direct and clear. Dr. Assam Hegyi, NASA water scientist working on several research projects on the impacts of climate change and desertification. And Dr. Amra Hamzawi, director of the Middle East program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you both very much. And we look forward
Thank you
to
so much.
Arabic. We look forward
Sure.
to Arabic.
Sure.
Thank you, Marlene.
Bye.
Thank you, Assam. It's been
Bye.
great to join both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.